The War of the Irregular is war in the minor key. His battles are brief yet bitter. His main weapon is surprise. Rogers' Rangers fought the French in 18th century North America. They were the first irregular unit of the regular British Army. They were the forebears of the modern Special Forces. Units like this, the Special Air Service Regiment, or SAS. Most armies have their own special forces, from the United States with its Green Berets, to the Soviet Union and its Spetsnaz. All of these are elite units, set apart because of the way they train and operate. They are the Irregulars, working in the motto of the SAS, that who dares, wins. Most irregular wars, however, are not fought by soldiers serving in a conventional army. They are fought by ordinary people struggling against an occupying power or oppressive regime. It's scenes like these that make us think that this sort of irregular warfare is something new. But it's a way of fighting that stretches back into prehistory. One of the earliest irregular attacks took place near here at the spring of Mayan Harod. In 1200 BC, the tribes of Israel were being constantly attacked and plundered by the Midianites. It was at this spring that the Jewish leader Gideon assembled what was virtually a guerrilla force to attack the army of the Midianites. From 32,000 volunteers, he selected only 300 men, divided them into 3 equal companies, and as well as weapons, gave them trumpets and torches hidden in jars. As it says in the book of Judges, "And so Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the Midian camp at the beginning of the middle watch. And the 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, and they cried, 'A sword for the Lord and for Gideon.'" There could be few better examples of a guerrilla night attack, making excellent use of noise, light, and surprise to confuse the enemy. The Midianites reacted as conventional forces have often done since, when attacked by small and determined groups with a belief in their cause. They fled in panic. It was in these mountains on the border between Spain and France that the word by which we now know this sort of fighting was born, guerrilla. It's Spanish for little war. In this wild countryside, the regular French armies of Napoleon were frequently harassed by armed bands of Spanish fighters. In 1812, here in the pass of Salinas, a Spanish guerrilla force fell upon a huge French convoy, butchered most of its army escort, and freed 450 Spanish prisoners. Here were all the conditions that make for a war where guerrillas can succeed: an overextended army, an elusive enemy, and a terrain both unfamiliar and inhospitable. These same conditions existed in Yugoslavia during the Second World War. A small band of partisans soon became a very effective opposition to their German invaders. For they had in Marshal Tito that other essential in guerrilla warfare, a skillful and determined leader.
Napoleon said it's not, in war, it's not men that matter, it's the man. And that was very true, because in Tito they had an absolutely outstanding leader, both military and political. I would say the greatest guerrilla leader there's ever been.
The partisans attacked the German lines of communication again and again. They never fought pitched battles, but would sabotage German installations wherever they were least defended. Railways are always a prime target for the guerrilla, as they are very difficult to defend and very easy to destroy.
I've talked to Germans since the war who fought in Yugoslavia, and I was delighted to hear from them how extremely disagreeable it was to serve there. They never knew when they were going to be blown up or shot in the back or whatever. And that is exactly the frame of mind you want to induce.
Soon the partisans became such a threat that the Germans mounted a major offensive against them. It was to be the first of 7 offensives. In 1942, 19 Axis divisions were needed to hold Yugoslavia, troops who could have been used elsewhere on the Eastern Front. They inflicted heavy casualties on Tito's forces, but they could never destroy them completely. The Germans looked on the partisans with contempt, calling them bandits. They terrorized the ordinary population, so they would be too scared either to help or to join the partisans. In one incident in October 1941, over 2,000 civilians were shot in reprisal for the death of just 28 Germans. This brutality has been a recurrent theme in guerrilla fighting from the Spanish Peninsula War onwards, for neither side will ever acknowledge that the other side should be fighting at all. One man's terrorist becomes another man's freedom fighter. There are no laws or conventions that govern guerrilla warfare, apart from the certain death of anyone who is taken prisoner. This huge defensive ditch round the fortress at Arras in northern France has become a memorial to this savagery. In all their occupied countries, the Germans used this same iron repression against anyone who dared to take up arms and resist them. 220 Frenchmen were shot here between August 1941 and July 1944. Some had carried out sabotage of railways or industrial installations. Some had helped Allied airmen or prisoners to escape. Some had taken part in small but savage battles against the invaders. It was an ugly, vicious, but for the French a very necessary form of war. By carrying on the struggle after the defeat of 1940, the resistance not only kept the Germans under pressure, but also helped to preserve the honor and pride of the French nation. Well, the motives of these resistance fighters were, of course, mixed. Some wanted simply to assert their passionate patriotism. Some saw political advantage in spearheading opposition to the invaders. And others were young men, eager, as young men often are, for a scrap. But almost all of them were urged on by an immense anger, by the kind of belief in their cause that makes men discount risks and ignore the usual rules of military advantage. It was to be in China that guerrilla warfare finally came of age by playing a decisive role in securing revolution. In 1927, centuries of resentment found expression in a communist-led urban rising. It failed when the protesters were brutally massacred. Eventually, there was only one thing left to the communists, and that was retreat. On the 16th of October, 1934, about 90,000 men, women, and children set off on what became known as the Long March.
I was amazed to see how everything worked like clockwork. The discipline was to know their position in the whole rank and the whole long file. See, it would stretch for miles. And, for instance, we had to keep our position. We knew the man who was before and after.
After traveling nearly 6,000 miles, the survivors reached the very remote and mountainous Shenxi province. Here they set up their base in the caves at Yan'an. It was now that Mao Zedong emerged as their leader and developed his idea of how to rid China of all enemies of their revolution. He decided to harness the power of guerrilla warfare into a method of fighting which became known as the protracted war. Firstly, and most importantly, the peasants had to be won over to the communist side and then organized. Mao argued that the people are to the guerrilla as water is to fish. They are essential to survival. The Red Army was scrupulous in maintaining good relations with the peasants.
The ordinary common people were afraid of the communists coming because they had been pictured as very cruel and so forth. And of course they were to a certain class of people. But to the poor people, they were kind.
The second stage of Mao Zedong's idea was to use guerrilla warfare to tie down the enemy and wear away his strength. As he wrote, "The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue." It was at this stage that the communists had formed a shaky alliance with the nationalist government to fight the invading Japanese. For although the Japanese had far superior forces with much better equipment, they could never be sure where they might be ambushed next. When they tried to pursue the guerrillas would simply disappear, only to reappear somewhere else to stage another ambush. The Japanese responded to this guerrilla warfare in the time-honored fashion. They called it the 3-all policy of counterinsurgency: burn all, kill all, and destroy all. By the end of 1942, the Red Army had been reduced by a quarter, and their local civilian population had been almost halved. But the Japanese were unable to destroy the people's spirit, and it was on this that the guerrilla thrived. The third and final phase of Mao's strategy for the protracted war was when the revolutionary forces should embark on open and conventional warfare. In China, this followed the defeat of the Japanese, when the Red Army first secured the countryside and then fought the nationalists city by city, using the tanks and artillery which they'd already captured. Mao's proclamation of the People's Republic of China in October 1949 was concrete proof that irregular warfare was no longer just the war of the flea. He had shown that a popular, irregular force could eventually defeat a well-equipped conventional army. Since the Second World War, there have been many campaigns, from Vietnam to Cuba and from South Africa to Afghanistan, in which the strategically weak have fought the strategically strong by using irregular warfare. None of these campaigns have been exact replicas of the war in China. However, there is a definite pattern of similarities. They all begin with a preliminary stage in which the revolutionaries build up support among the ordinary population. It is vital for the guerrillas to have the active support of the people. Otherwise, they risk becoming simply armed bandits. El Salvador has been the scene of guerrilla fighting since 1970. It started with a period in which a small corps of revolutionaries tried to explain to the people that the only way of solving their grievances was by force of arms. This political agitation was reinforced by numerous acts of sabotage designed to demonstrate both the power of the revolutionaries and the vulnerability of the government. Targets had to be chosen carefully so as not to alienate the revolutionaries' newfound supporters.
Bueno, el sabotaje más que todo es para desquebrajar la economía del país, porque realmente de esa economía del país no llega nada a manos del pueblo. Entonces, desquebrajando la economía, nosotros vemos que estamos desestabilizando al gobierno.
Another tactic is selective assassination of army, police and government personnel in an attempt to highlight the inability of the authorities to maintain law and order and to goad the exasperated security forces into overreacting. The revolutionaries do not just require popular support in general. They also need to recruit guerrilla fighters who will be prepared to risk their lives. On the 22nd of January 1980, a demonstration was organized by 3 left-wing groups. 100,000 people took part. Within 2 hours of marching through the streets of the capital, San Salvador, they were fired on by their right-wing opponents. Immediately, the demonstrators scattered, and armed insurgents took up position to cover their escape. These activists formed the basis for future guerrilla units. During the next phase of the Revolutionary War, the guerrillas established secure bases. This usually happens when they move out of the towns and cities and into remote parts of the countryside. It will be from these bases that they will operate, and the bases will also provide the guerrillas with a refuge in which they can attempt to lead normal, everyday lives.
Esa es la guerra de guerrilla. Que haga un golpe por aquí, bueno, a la media hora da un golpe por allá. O el día siguiente vuelve a golpear ahí mismo, golpea en otro lugar. Esa pequeña unidad, una sola unidad. Así se hace la guerra de guerrilla.
The regular army is usually better equipped than the guerrillas, though even helicopters are of limited use against an enemy who is constantly disappearing. Patrols are stepped up in an effort to deter guerrilla attacks, but a soldier on a patrol like this always has the lurking suspicion that his patrol might be the next to be ambushed. The guerrillas cannot exist simply on revolutionary fervor. They need money to sustain their campaign. Some of it they will liberate in the traditional bank holdup, while some they collect from the passengers of passing buses and cars. With this, they can buy weapons on the black market and the necessary materials with which to make their own mines, bombs, and grenades. However, traditionally, their weapons are obtained from the regular army, against whom they're fighting.
El ataque del Paraíso, por ejemplo, ahí salieron más de 12 camionadas llenas de par, una cantidad innumerable de munición para cañones. Bueno, y en muchos ataques así se han gastado 500, 5.000 tiros para sacar 15.000. Sacarlo gastado y todavía que quede más reserva.
The regular soldier always has an objective to take, or ground to win, which he will then defend whatever the cost. The guerrilla, on the other hand, just needs to keep going. He will only attack where he can be assured of success, such as here in the taking of this provincial town. When, soon afterwards, the army counterattacked, the guerrillas didn't even defend the town. They simply disappeared again into the hills. Sometimes, with the prospect of an army attack, the guerrillas will decide to evacuate an entire area which they've been holding. So rather than try and defend the civilian population who have been supporting them, they will take them all with them. Here, all the inhabitants of a guerrilla-occupied area move out with those possessions which they can carry on a long march to avoid the army. When the soldiers arrive, all they will find will be empty homes, which they will burn. They will then maintain a presence for a while. However, there's little point in guarding an empty area. They would only be a target for guerrilla attack. So within a few days, they will withdraw. Once it is safe, the civilians and the guerrillas will seep back, like water into a sponge. The war in El Salvador hasn't yet progressed to the third stage. when the guerrillas emerge to fight in the pitched battles of conventional warfare. Yet there is nothing inevitable about guerrilla victory in this or any other war, as the British proved in Malaya. In June 1948, a state of emergency was declared in Malaya after a number of guerrilla attacks and acts of sabotage. They were inspired by the Malayan Communist Party, attempting to end British rule by exploiting the friction between the Chinese and Malay communities. Michael Calvert, an expert on guerrilla warfare, was asked to make a study of the problem.
Guerrillas have got to live on the population. There's nothing sufficient to eat in the jungle. They've got to get resupply, and they've got to get medical, they've got to get information, intelligence, and everything from the population. So the first thing was to isolate the Chinese, mainly Chinese, into villages which were protected and had definite markings and which they weren't allowed out at night.
This was swiftly done in an operation mounted by British troops and Malay police to move the Chinese inhabitants of 410 shanty villages on the edges of the jungle. They were taken to the new protected villages, which were to be their new home. Once they were installed, perimeter fences were erected and guard patrols mounted to prevent the guerrillas from contacting their former supporters. During the hours of daylight, they were allowed in and out of the villages, so long as they were carrying their identity cards. The British Army was totally unused to fighting guerrillas in the jungle. They either kept to the roads, or they moved so clumsily through the dense vegetation that they had little chance of catching the guerrillas. Improved training was one answer to the problem. In addition, Calvert argued, what was needed was a totally different sort of army unit to spearhead the campaign.
A dedicated counterinsurgency force which would live in the jungle, live, move, and have their being in the same jungle as the guerrillas. I say get into the same bloodstream as the guerrilla, and when they met them, would fight them, and we hope beat them.
The army unit which seemed best fitted to take on this daunting task was the then disbanded Special Air Service Regiment. It had fought with great distinction in the Western Desert, raiding installations far behind the German lines. Its success was based on an idea conceived by its founder, David Stirling.
The whole purpose of the SAS was to be able to live for long periods behind the lines. Whereas the smallest unit in the commando was 12 men. In the case of the SAS, each troop should be divided down to 2 subunits of 4 men, and that each should be capable of operating by itself. We were a totally strategic type unit. One man would know a particular amount of navigation. Another would be fully trained in medical side. Another would have his specialist learning in explosives and every form of sabotage and so on. Each of them were equally capable of doing any task. The magic of having 4 men was that it wasn't commanded by any particular one of them.
This ability to work in isolation meant that they were quickly reformed as the Malayan Scouts SAS. Hunting guerrillas in the jungle was to be a different form of fighting to attacking Germans in the Western Desert. They had a lot to learn.
I think we learned that it's much better to always go in a slow hurry rather than at great speed. It's a tingling of the nerves. It's a complete alertness of all the senses. The vision is restricted. The noises of the jungle have to be learnt and listened to. And when these noises stop, you have to know the reason why.
We used to move at about 1,000 yards an hour, and you'd stop every hour for a rest of about 5 or 10 minutes. If you thought you were in an area where there were terrorists, you used to stop a lot more frequent, so you could pick up any smells or signs. Anything foreign in the jungle, you could smell it, you could pick it up straight away. The terrorists, we had some surrendered enemy personnel gave a lecture once, and they reckoned that they could smell scented soap that had been used, or toothpaste with the mint smell in it. They could smell that about 2 or 3 miles downriver, where it had floated down on the surface, you know. Even if they came out, if they walked across a track where a patrol had had their rum ration the night before, the smell used to come out in a sweat.
Because progress on foot in the jungle was so slow, the SAS developed a new speciality, tree jumping. This involved parachuting into the dense jungle canopy and landing in the trees. Just one of the specialized techniques the SAS was to adopt to achieve surprise.
Tree jumping used to terrify you, you know, but the thing was to get into the trees and get hung up, because the people that were injured were people that went straight through the trees. So that as soon as you got to up the tree, the thing to do was swing over, make yourself secure, and then just abseil down.
The jungle patrols kept the guerrillas moving and thus prevented them from active fighting. However, in order to catch the guerrillas, the SAS needed to mount jungle ambushes. They required enormous patience and perseverance.
We used to just go to sleep at night under a sort of poncho cover, you know, in the morning before first light, that poncho cover came down, everything was hidden up, and you just lay there for 28 days, you know. And, you know, you got to know everything was moved, you know, you think, oh, right, that lizard should be coming along about now, you know, so you used to see a lot of wildlife when you're in ambush, because you were lying still all the time. There was nothing, you know. One day I can remember us watching a snake. It started off one side of this tree, and there was a lizard on the other, you know, and it took it about, 6 hours, this snake just gradually creeping up, and finally it got this lizard, you know.
The security forces did more than just fight the guerrillas. They also developed what became known as the Hearts and Minds campaign. With propaganda picture sheets, they sought to win the primitive tribes of Aborigines onto the side of the government, and thus deny the guerrillas their source of supply. By various means, such as medical clinics, they showed that the government, rather than the guerrillas, offered a better life to the Aborigines. The British counter-guerrilla campaign in Malaya became a textbook example of how a conventional army could win the war against a dedicated guerrilla force. For by isolating the guerrillas and pursuing them into the jungle, the British effectively broke the hold of the communists and enabled Malaya to gain its independence in 1957. During the war in Vietnam, the Americans copied some of these counter-guerrilla techniques. In the Central Highlands of South Vietnam, there are about 20 different tribes of primitive people who are known collectively as the Montagnards. During the early 1960s, the highland forests and jungles where they lived provided the Viet Cong guerrillas with useful base areas and infiltration routes. They used the Montagnards as their source of food and support. The Americans used their special forces, or Green Berets, to befriend the Montagnards, win them over to the South Vietnamese government, and thus deny the Viet Cong guerrillas their support. Using the Hearts and Minds approach developed by the British in Malaya, they found that medicine was the best way of getting the Montagnards onto their side.
Well, I was a Special Forces medic assigned to an A-team, which is a 12-man team. And my job was to be what was known as a bush doctor. The Montagnards never seen a doctor. Right? And I would take care of not only my 12-man A-team, but I would take care of all of the villages that was in my area.
You want some?
Gradually, the Green Berets gained the confidence of the Montagnards and persuaded them to defend their villages against the Viet Cong. The young men were provided with uniform and equipment, and the Green Berets gave them an extensive training program with a variety of different weapons. Eventually, the Americans were able to use the Montagnards in an offensive role, fighting alongside the Green Berets. They were under no illusion about what sort of an enemy the Viet Cong were. They were excellent guerrilla fighters who would often base themselves in elaborate underground tunnel systems. The Montagnards may have lacked many of the attributes of regular soldiers, but their local knowledge and fieldcraft made them invaluable allies to the Green Berets and deadly opponents to the Viet Cong.
We were on patrol one night, and a Montagnard said there's a Viet Cong in a tree about 300 meters ahead. And I looked at this guy and I said, sure there is. I called for a starlight scope, which is a scope that makes everything look like daytime. I couldn't see anybody in any tree, right? And so then another guy brought up what's known as an infrared scope, which shows body heat. Again, nothing showed up on the scope. Well, he picked up his crossbow, put an arrow in it, and fired it, and all you hear was this, then a ta-dum. Body hit the ground. He said that guy was there for days.
Even with a successful Hearts and Minds campaign, the underlying brutality of irregular warfare was an ever-present threat to the Green Beret search and destroy patrols.
So we tried to run, and they surrounded us, and we had an ensuing gun battle. And they ended up, two of my team members were killed, were wounded. They were killed later. Two of them were wounded. 3 Montagnards were killed, and they captured us. Then they took the Montagnards who were still alive and killed them one by one in front of us, and then dismembered the bodies, one by one. And then they took my two team members who were wounded, and were going to do the same to it. Well, I got them to stop that, and they held us for 47 days, and they put us in holes in the ground, 8 feet deep, 4 feet by 4 feet. And that's the way we lived until we managed an escape. And during the escape, only 7 of us made it, 5 were killed.
The task of special forces is to operate in small groups far away from any other unit. Since Malaya, the SAS have served all over the world. Their type of fighting requires each member of the 4-man patrol to have a particular personal skill. One of them will be a linguist, able to speak a language such as Malay, Arabic, or Chinese. Another will be a skilled medic. The third will be a communications expert, while the fourth will know all about explosives and sabotage. In Borneo, during the confrontation with Indonesia in the early 1960s, the SAS was again involved in jungle fighting. But this time, instead of hunting guerrillas, the SAS used guerrilla tactics to fight the regular Indonesian army, raiding its bases and ambushing its patrols. More recently, the SAS fought in Oman during the 1970s in the wild and mountainous Dofa province in the south of the country. An SAS soldier has to be able to fight in any terrain at very short notice, and the deserts of Oman involved a totally different approach to the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Oman, they were successful in raising a force of irregular tribesmen who, under the SAS's leadership, helped end the war and restore the authority of the Sultan.
I think the reason why the SAS were both chosen and suitable were the qualities of mental maturity and physical toughness that they have as individuals, together with their training and expertise and their experience in operating in small groups, often in remote and isolated parts of the world.
We set off in pairs at 5-minute intervals.
The skills required of an SAS soldier mean that his selection must be exceptionally thorough and comprehensive. The men who join the 22nd SAS Regiment are all volunteers from the Army, Navy or Air Force. They are probably in their early to mid-20s, with several years of regular training behind them. The qualities that their instructors will be looking for are those of the self-disciplined individualist. Physical toughness alone is not enough, although it is important. And the first phase of selection is a series of grueling orienteering exercises across the Brecon beacons. These get progressively longer and more difficult.
You're going to 892686. You're going to 825642.
Oh, every day is tough, you know, when I go across them beacons and that. I feel like just giving it all up, just, you know, dropping the berg and just forgetting it, you know, go back home. But you don't. You just, you know, everybody has these thoughts and you feel like jacking it in and that, but you just keep going. Because you know you're going to finish. And the thing is, any time I do feel like jacking it in, I'm halfway between 2 checkpoints anyway, so you still got to keep going. and so you just keep going. You don't jack it in, and so it's a challenge every day. Every day you come out, it doesn't kill you. I mean, it's there to be done, and it can be done, not easily, but it can be done. After a time, fitness doesn't come into it because everybody's over there is all fit, right? And when you're trogging for about 6 hours, and then it's determination that comes into it, and I think that's what it mainly is, determination and go. I mean, everybody's fit there, it's just the blokes who've got more determination. They're the ones that'll do it. I think I've got the determination.
Throughout the selection, the candidates are under continual assessment. If they want to, they're allowed to withdraw voluntarily at any time during the course. Otherwise, if the instructors feel that a candidate is not up to standard, he'll be taken off the course and returned to his original army unit. For although many volunteer, few are chosen. Less than 10% will go on to join the SAS. The majority will find themselves having a surprisingly sympathetic final interview with the officer commanding training.
The exercises you did with us, did you feel that they were run fairly enough? There was no attempt made to trick you or...
No, I must admit I've learned something every day, either about myself or some new skills that I've either forgotten or I've relearned. I mean, right. I learned something every day whilst I was here.
So it hasn't been time wasted?
No.
Relieved to hear it. Right. Okay. Come back for a second attempt at any time in the future you feel ready. A bit more effort on the fitness side, perhaps, and a bit more map study, the theory side of the map reading.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we look forward to seeing you.
Good morning, gentlemen. My aim is to set a troop ambush at grid 515429.
Officers follow exactly the same selection procedure as the men, but they are also expected to prepare and present a whole series of operational plans to an audience of experienced NCOs and men, who will cross-question them in minute detail. For an SAS officer has to take account of the tremendous expertise that will be under his command.
That's it, gentlemen. Are there any questions?
Yes, you said you were going to initiate the ambush. How are you actually going to do that?
I'll actually initiate the ambush by firing the claymore.
There are other qualities of leadership that are unique to the Special Forces.
Everybody needs good leaders, but the SAS leader of whatever rank is a leader in isolation, and he's a leader who has no one to turn to. In the normal battalion, you can turn to the man above you. In the SAS, when you're on operations, there is no one to turn to. The buck stops there with you.
Selection continues over the next 5 months. Towards the end of this time, the remaining candidates, together with members of other army units, are given a comprehensive course on combat survival. For any SAS soldier must be able to live off the land when necessary.
And this is an example of a one-man hide itself. What I want now, just somebody lift hold of that hand there. All it is, you lift up, and you now can see the structure that's inside. What you've done is you've dug down approximately 2 feet, all right? The length of your own personal body, and at the end there you've got your 9-inch sump. That's your soak away to allow any water that's in there to get away out into the area.
At the end of their course, they are let loose in the Welsh hills with nothing except battle dress and greatcoats. They have to survive and avoid a hunter force which pursues them.
Brothers in the wood! Up! We're going to go to the track!
Once captured, they are then taken away for interrogation. For it is essential that an SAS soldier must be able to resist all forms of interrogation. The success of an operation and the lives of the rest of his unit must never be jeopardized. If they pass all this, they will consider themselves badged, for they can now wear the famous beige beret with the winged dagger badge.
one does not breathe a sigh of relief when the selection course is over. The first hurdle is over, but then comes the training in the skills and your actual performance on an operation. And it is not unknown, it's unusual, but it is not unknown for a man to be told even a year or two after he has been in the SAS that he's no longer needed.
When he joins the regiment, the SAS soldier is trained not only in his individual speciality, but also in a collective skill, such as high-level parachuting. For the SAS need to be capable of crossing every sort of obstacle to reach their objective as quickly and as secretly as possible. Another troop specializes in purpose-built Land Rovers for desert operations. Boat troop can handle every sort of small amphibious craft, and mountain troop can scale any peak in all climates.
Their training, their skills, and the preparation they take before any operation is specifically directed towards a precise objective.
In 1982, these skills were put to the test in the Falklands. While the main British task force was assembling and leaving Portsmouth to sail to the South Atlantic, D Squadron of the SAS were already on their way. In the Falklands, they were used on many secret operations before the main landings. On the night of 11th May 1982, an 8-man recce party set off in their canoes towards Pebble Island. At the time, the British were unsure what was on Pebble Island. Intelligence reports suggested it might contain a radar station and an airstrip held by a small garrison of Argentinian soldiers. The recce party's task was to find out exactly what was on Pebble Island and then report back. With the help of some of the men who took part in the original operation, we have reconstructed that raid. They first checked that the beach was clear, then hid their canoes, and finally concealed themselves to wait out the daylight hours. Their training paid off. Later in the day, an Argentinian helicopter flew right over without spotting them. The commander of the operation takes up the story.
It's a question then of moving forward, what would you call the close reconnaissance. Only 2 men went forward. The intention was to confirm we had a target. One had to get fairly close. At this stage, we wanted detailed information. After all, we're bringing in a squadron to attack. The patrol was able to look onto the airstrip and see, in fact, there were 11 aircraft up there, which were very well dispersed around the airstrip. As soon as possible after dark, they did move back and put together a message to be transmitted back to the squadron on Hermes. The squadron inserted an additional 40 men towards the islands through a very dark and stormy night. It would be wrong to say that tension was rising in any particularly dramatic way, but we were anxious to get off the helicopters as soon as we were on land. The sooner really we would become masters of our own destiny. We had chosen the drop-off point some way back from the target. In fact, it was about 5 miles to be quite certain that the enemy would not hear our approach. But nevertheless, we wanted to get those helicopters very quickly, so deplane as quickly as possible, and the helicopter lifted off. The commanders came forward to the patrol and received the updated plan.
Okay, if you can close in now, because this position is defended. Okay, it's going to have to be a very quick briefing because we're about an hour late now.
Personally, I've been clock watching ever since I left Hermes, and I knew I was beginning to run out of time. The whole process couldn't have taken more than a quarter of an hour from drop-off to confirm brief to move off, but it seemed like an age.
Right position here, and then we're split up.
All in all, people were carrying a lot of equipment that night. I would say the average load would have been a Bergen of about 40 or 50 pounds, and belt equipment, say 20 or 30 pounds. So we reached the final RV, the launch point, at 7:30, which was also not only a final checkpoint for the return of the troops, but also was going to be the mortar position. troops, as they reached the point, dropped off their mortar bombs they were carrying, with the mortar team who established themselves. And I thought, well, since we're here, we might as well let the troops go forward and do what damage they could for 15 minutes. As it turned out, actually, I had great difficulty in getting them back, and didn't get them back for 45 minutes.
Was a complete success. The SAS destroyed 11 Argentinian aircraft with only one man wounded. It reminded some of those taking part of the stories they had heard about David Stirling and the original SAS when they attacked German airstrips in the Western Desert during the Second World War. But above all, it highlighted two of the most important themes in all irregular warfare: total surprise and the precise use of force. For although the details of this raid are modern, the principles are ancient. These burning Pokhara aircraft reflect the flaming torches carried by Gideon's small band of warriors 4,000 years ago.